You have to really trust your gut as a founder, but you also have to balance that with having the right people in the room to give you advice. You have to crowdsource the input, but at the end of the day, you have to trust your gut to make that final decision. And I think that balance can be tough for folks to find, but it's incredibly important. And then probably last piece of advice is get outside of your comfort zone, doing something that's unnatural for you in the organization. But in order for the business to grow, you have to grow as an individual.
Welcome to the Pantrium Podcast. Here, there's no fluff and no sales pitches, just real conversations. I'm your host, Christie H.Kristensen, and at Pantrium, we bring together bold and curious founders and leaders to share their stories, their lessons they have learned, and the hard truth behind their success. We are all about challenging the status quo and explore fresh perspectives while focusing on what really matters: people. If you're craving deeper conversations, you're in the right space. So let's dive in. Caleb, thank you so much for joining the Pantrium Podcast. I've been looking forward to this dialogue.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on the show today.
Of course. All right. As you know, the first question I ask all my guests is introducing themselves with a fun fact. So by all means, Caleb, what's your fun fact?
Yeah, so one thing that a lot of people don't know about me is that I'm actually ambidextrous. And so growing up when I was playing sports, whether that was baseball, football, tennis, ping pong, billiards, I can actually play right-handed or left-handed. And so just a little fun fact a lot of people don't know about me.
Ooh, so you were one of those kids everyone was jealous of because you could help out anywhere.
It was really frustrating, especially ping pong and billiards. I would beat people left-handed and then they'd be like, hold on a second, I thought you were right-handed. It's like, well, I am, but I can also play left-handed. And so just a little fun game that I would play with people, especially growing up.
Competitive advantage. I like it.
Exactly.
Oh, brilliant. All right. So as we're diving in today, we want to hear more about your career and your journey to establish Tilt. So just tell our listeners a bit, and also those that are not in the industry, layman terms, what do you actually do? And then how did you get there?
Yeah. So when I think about Tilt and what we do with Payfac-as-a-Service, I'll try and use as little industry jargon and abbreviations as I can. But the idea is that we're helping vertical software platforms. So think like a dental software platform or golf course tee time management software that wants to embed payments within their platform so that their merchants' customers can pay through that software. And so that dentist wants to enable its patients to be able to pay, or allowing the golfers to be able to make tee times on the platform. And so Tilt is providing the APIs and the technical infrastructure to allow our software partners to add payments into their software. And then the real key is that they can generate revenue after every single payment that's generated through that platform. And so we're helping these companies replace tools like Stripe and then start generating revenue streams off of these payments.
Very cool. And I want to know about the journey to get there. Starting a business, that's not an easy journey. Can you tell me a little bit more about your own experience?
Yeah, so my career progression, I've been in payments my entire career. Started my first payments company when I was 19, going door to door, selling payments to small business owners. And so this crazy world of payments is really the only, thing that I've ever known. And as I was scaling up that first company, and that first business, we were placing terminals, in small businesses. And over time, as we scaled that up, what we started to see was that these small business owners no longer just wanted a terminal to process payments. They really wanted integrated software that could help them run every aspect of their business: payroll, scheduling, payments, lending, whatever. They wanted all of these additional feature functionality. And so I started doing consulting for these, vertical software platforms that were trying to understand what their options were within the payments landscape. And after a few years of doing this consulting work and realizing that no matter what option I recommended to these software companies, they were always frustrated with either the technology, the user experience, the money that they were making. They were having to essentially choose between, one of these, preferred solutions. And about 6 years ago, I decided, hey, maybe I could go build, that optimal solution that these vertical software platforms, would really love. And so the journey, for Tilled was really born in all of this pain and all of this experience working with the same types of companies that are now our end customers, and just seeing the frustration with the existing options that were out there. And then finally making, the decision that I was crazy enough to go start another company in the payment space. And that's what became Tilled and what we call Payfac-as-a-Service.
Yeah. And you say you were crazy enough to venture and to start your own. I'm sure it's not any secret that any startup founder would say that it's tough. What was part of your journey? What were some of those biggest lessons you learned through that journey?
Yeah, I think if you start your career in door-to-door sales, you learn a lot about yourself as a person, whether it's in payments or something else. And I think for me, you learn a lot about rejection. You learn a lot about perseverance. You learn a lot about internal motivation. Like the first business that I was building up, it's a commission-only gig. I'm an entrepreneur. You eat what you kill. If you're not successful, you're not making any money. And the idea of going door to door and trying to sell, anything to small business owners is pretty daunting. I could walk into 20, 25 businesses in a day. I might get 5 or 6 doors slammed in my face, and I might have one good conversation if I'm lucky, in a day. And so you really learn a lot about, what motivates you and how you're able to kind of persevere, through that rejection. And I think for me, going through all of that experience so early on in my career, it really made me realize that I can do almost anything. I can handle the rejection. I can handle, the no's. And for me, it's, the excitement of the journey and solving these problems, for our customers that, motivates me through, the pain and the craziness of being, an entrepreneur and a founder.
Yeah. And how did that, thick-skinned, I'm okay with being told no 20 times a day. How did that mold you? And can you see some of those learnings you brought with you into your growth through Tilled?
Definitely. I think in the early days of Tilled, I was very willing to go out there and speak to, would-be customers of the Tilled platform to get feedback on what we were thinking about building, what we were building. And when I talk to a lot of, entrepreneurs, especially first-time entrepreneurs, they're really hesitant to go out there and get customer feedback until the product is, quote unquote, perfect. And the reality is the product is never actually going to be perfect until you go out and talk, to those end customers and those end users. And so, having had that, door-to-door experience, I was very willing to, cold email or cold call, founders. And I think one of the things that was really surprising to me was how receptive other founders were to actually providing feedback, in the early days. But if I hadn't been brave enough to, reach out to these founders long before I actually had a product and say, hey, I'm thinking about building, this business. Is this something that would be valuable, to you? It's pretty incredible to me how much those early conversations shaped the development, that we did in the early days, building out, that first iteration of the product. Whereas otherwise we could have completely missed, on the first version of Tilled that we built out and wasted a lot of time and money in the process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious because being agile and nimble and move very quickly, also after gathering feedback from customers or prospects, how did you maintain that agility as you were growing and the company got bigger and bigger over time?
Yeah, I think some of that is just, in your DNA as a person. And I consider myself a reasonably intense and competitive individual. And so I want to win. I want to, go be successful. And so for me, a lot of it was making sure that the early employees that we were hiring, in the early days of Tilled had a lot of that same, entrepreneurial problem solving, kind of move fast, break things, mindset. Because when you're in that 0 to 1 phase, you're constantly learning what's working, what's not working, and you're having to evolve, very quickly. And I think the mindset of the types of people that you need to work with at that stage of the business is actually pretty different than the mindset of the people that, like, now, as we're really starting to scale, the business. It's a different persona, it's a different lens. And so aligning myself with the right types of people in the early days was really critical to maintain that, intensity, and that, hey, we're gonna iterate through this quickly kind of mindset.
And I guess also over time, as you were saying, you might have another, well, you have a certain need in the beginning of your journey and have a different need over time. How did you bring your team through that journey from, going from 1 to 100? How did you do that from a culture perspective?
Yeah, that was probably one of the biggest challenges for me, in this kind of first 6 years of Tild, was just navigating through both the cultural changes and then ultimately, inevitably some of the personnel changes that needed to be made. And I think for me, one of the um traps that I, fell into was this idea of loyalty. And so loyalty can be an incredible asset where I really value the people that have been loyal to me. And I think I, have a tendency to be, incredibly loyal, almost to a fault, to people, that have been riding with me. And I think the reality is at times that can also be a blind spot where you're not recognizing that, hey, maybe these aren't, the right people. Maybe this isn't the right, process. Maybe these aren't the right customers for us, at this stage of the game. And so for me, there was a lot of like introspection that had to take place to really, realize that we needed to make, some changes in the business. And, ultimately, I think one of the reasons why I was able to do that was because I was surrounding myself with people that were willing to have those hard conversations and say, hey, I don't think this is working, or I don't think this, person is really working, right now. And you have to be able to foster that culture where it's not only okay, it's actually celebrated to have those brave, vulnerable moments where you're sharing, that critical feedback. And I think creating that culture where that's okay, it's actually one of the core values, of Tild, is to be brave. I think that's what allowed us to navigate, ultimately what were some bumpy moments, along the way as we were making those changes to get ourselves in a position where, we had the right people, we had the right, positions to set ourselves up for success and scale.
And that must be really difficult. I'm wondering, could you share some of those things that you would have done differently if you would have to go back?
Yeah. I think for us, one of the like key lessons was that we had a leadership coach that was helping us navigate, through this process. And so having someone that was a little bit more unbiased because they weren't really directly impacted by the changes, but actually had enough context because they were working with, the group, of us as a leadership team to actually be able to weigh in on the situation, I think was incredibly valuable to us. And I think the challenge, for me at various points in my career, I think for some entrepreneurs is you're either, you don't really have anyone that you can turn to for that advice. And so you're stuck in this, loop of, hey, do I trust my gut? Or, how do I make this decision? Or you're seeking advice from people that don't actually have the full context, in the situation. And so looking back, I think, had we hired, a leadership coach earlier on in the process, that could have made, a bigger difference by giving us that resource that, had the context, had the experience, and was, at least in my opinion, a bit more unbiased, and, less emotional about the decisions that needed to be made.
And just what advice would you give to others sitting in this pivotal moment where they know they have to switch gears and change the way that they're running their business or looking for a coach, like you're saying?
We actually did go through a few attempts at finding the right, leadership coach before we landed on the guy that we have now. And I think for me, a lot of it came down to like a personality match. And I felt like with a lot of the initial leadership coaches that we were working with, some of them were willing to provide, more critical feedback to other members on the team, but several of them just weren't willing to actually stand up and tell me what I, needed to hear. And I think in the first conversation with this guy, Scott, he told me exactly what I didn't want to hear, but I needed, to hear, and still, remember that conversation. I'm like, wow, I left this conversation incredibly uncomfortable. And I think that's exactly, what Tild needs, now and in this moment. So if you can find that person that's, willing to, push you, I think that's incredibly valuable.
Yeah. No, I think there's something very strong in the sense of feeling uncomfortable, because sometimes you feel uncomfortable when you're hearing a truth that might hurt, or you know that it's true, but you just have kind of been dodging it for a while. So I very much agree with you on that one. I wanted to move on, and as we are kind of looking into your recipes of success, perhaps, and I know in our prep call before this, you touched upon the concept of personal branding and a focus on that. Can you just share a little bit more on your work on personal branding and what that has meant to you?
Yeah, I think for me, LinkedIn has been such a huge part of building out Tild really from the very beginning, and it's definitely not anything that I would have called Plan A or even BCD early on in Tild, where for me as an individual, I've never really been a big, fan of social media. I was never active on Facebook. I don't have Instagram, Twitter. Like I don't do any, of these other, platforms. But for me in the early
Good
days
for
of
you.
Till,
You're not
uh,
losing time on
I'm
them
not
then.
distracted by any of that. I think between running a business and having three little kids, my free
Yeah.
time is already at a minimum. And so some of it's, probably more necessity than choice,
Mhm.
at this stage of life. But I think for me, LinkedIn was an outlet, especially during COVID, just sharing the good, the bad, and the ugly of the entrepreneurial, journey. And I think I was very surprised with, how receptive, people were to that like authentic voice. Like it's not just, hey, here's all the wins, that we're celebrating. It's like, hey, here's what didn't go well today, or hey, my kid lost it while I was on, a call. It's like that's just the reality of, what I was going through, at that point in time. And, fast forward, here, 5, 6 years later, LinkedIn is such a critical part of our employment process. So when we're, putting out new job ads, we're getting hundreds of applicants that are coming in from these LinkedIn posts. It's driving, customers our way. It's driving partners. It's driving investors. And I think it's pretty crazy, for me all these years later to realize the impact, that it's had on the business. But in the early days, it wasn't really like, hey, the first post that I put out there was just this incredible, viral moment. Like it took a lot of time to build up to that point of it really providing an impact. But I think for me it was a creative, outlet. And then as I started to see those gains, it was this kind of reinforcing factor of like, wow, this is really something that could have, a really meaningful, impact on the business.
Yeah. And what was your biggest kind of aha moment when you ventured into LinkedIn and used it? What was one of those big aha moments?
Yeah, I think for me, what I started to realize was that the more authentic the posts were, the more engagement, that it was driving, the more visibility, the more people in my DMs and reaching out. And I think if you go back to, the lessons from the door-to-door sales of, hey, you're gonna face, this rejection, you gotta have, this internal drive. I think it fostered the ability for me to venture outside, of my comfort zone, to say, hey, let's go, post about what's really going on, in the business. And I think ultimately, that's what, allowed me to really, build up that presence on LinkedIn, and, create a lot of the impact that it's had on Tild.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to talk about leadership style. It's also one of the things we touched upon, you know, with your leadership coach as well, and how you're then driving that cultural change within the organization. What were some of your discoverables when it comes to your own leadership style?
Yeah, I think for me, especially as we've really ramped up and built up the team, it's been interesting to see how important like storytelling has become, in my leadership style. Where for me, now as founder, CEO of this business, I'm here setting the vision for where the business is going to be 2, 3, 4, 5 years, out in the future. And so a lot of it's about creating this paradigm of what success looks like, and then finding really capable, people that can help us execute, towards that vision. And I think for me, if you asked me, 6 years ago, I wouldn't have really understood, how important, that was, in the grand scheme of building out the business. And so that's definitely been something that I wasn't, expecting, but has been a really critical part, of the journey, whether that's internally creating the motivation and the path to success for employees, or whether that's fundraising and creating, hey, here's the vision, for where we're headed, so that we can raise the money that we need to go. Or even, on the customer side of things, we created over the last 18 months an enterprise strategy that was just an idea in my head, 18 months ago. And I started vocalizing this concept of where, I thought we could go, for the business. And we were able to get some early, design partners on board, just based off of the kind of vision and the storytelling of, hey, here's a, a version of the world that I, envision. And these, monster corporations have agreed to come along with us, on this journey, which is pretty cool, at least from my seat.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you touched upon something, how looking back and reflecting back, what has been some of those key learnings from that personal journey of yours?
Yeah, I think you touched on a really critical piece, that like your role as the founder, as the CEO evolves, where, hey, when you're two guys in a garage or a team of five, your role is very different. You're rolling up your sleeves, you're doing all the things, you're wearing 100 hats, and like you have to be involved, in the nitty-gritty, working, in the business every single day. And I think as we've, scaled up the team and now have, dozens of employees across the country, there's still times where, I'm operating deep in the business, but I think more and more I'm trying to figure out, like, hey, when do I actually need to take a step back and work on the business, and be the leader that's zooming out and figuring out where we're going, what are the roadblocks, what are the obstacles, that we need to tackle. And I think a critical learning for me was recognizing that when I'm stressed, my natural tendency is to go, down in the weeds. And so now, as we're scaling up, when I'm at a point of stress, it's like, okay, what would I naturally want to go do, but also what is probably the right thing for me to be doing, at this point in time. And there's times where I'm catching myself saying, hey, here's naturally, where I would go, spend the next hour, of my time, but like, is that really the best use, of my time? Sometimes I'm capable of stopping myself, sometimes I'm not, but at least now it's something that, I'm consciously aware, of that tendency, and it's no longer a blind spot for me.
Two things I want to kind of unfold there. One being identifying it and realizing it's a blind spot, right? And then work with it, and perhaps also sometimes be, okay, I know I'm going into my weeds because that's kind of my little sweet spot in a way. But also, what do you like the most, being nitty gritty or in the helicopter?
I feel like the sales guy in me loves closing deals. And so, there's still a part of me that has a really hard time, letting go of occasionally getting involved in, some of the deals that we're doing. That's where I cut my teeth. That's where, my experience is. And I feel like that's just something that, like, I know I can go have, a positive impact on the business. And so it's like, I'm good at it. It's comfortable. It's familiar. And so that's kind of that quadrant where I'm like, hey, I know when things are tough, I can go lean into sales. I think I'm getting a hang for the vision casting and, the more kind of CEO part of the founder, CEO role, but not quite there yet, in terms of, the level of, excitement from the sales side of things.
Yeah. And you said storytelling. What does that mean to you?
Yeah, I think for me, it's all about, creating a paradigm, for whoever you're talking to. And so if that's for, our employees, saying, hey, here's where, we're at today, but really why you should get excited, why you want to be here, and why you should, be busting your butt every day, is because of this exciting vision for where, we're headed. And I think by being able to not only paint this vision of, hey, here's where we could go, but also, creating that paradigm and telling that story of here's how we get there, and being able to connect those dots, in a way for people where it's like, wow, that, 3-year, vision seems pretty, far-fetched. I don't know, I don't know how realistic, that is. But if you can break that down, into these bite-sized pieces where like, hey, here's what this means for you day to day. Here's what I need you to go do, over the next 3, 6, 12 months. They're going to make a meaningful impact, towards this longer term vision. All of a sudden you're connecting the dots for, an individual employee that's like, hey, here's the work that I'm doing day in and day out and how that's actually contributing, to the long-term success of the business. And I think that can be, an incredible motivator from a culture, perspective, because you've got all of these people that are united around a common vision, that are working incredibly hard, to go achieve something that like today might seem kind of impossible. But that's what entrepreneurship is all about.
Yeah. And I noticed you said as well that this is a constant journey for yourself as well, that you're constantly learning how to bring people with you and have that CEO or more kind of corporate role, I suppose, as a founder. What's your areas of focus where you would love to develop your own skills and that you are currently looking to fine tune?
Yeah, I think for me, when I look at what we're building here at Tild, we are a technology stack, and so the product is really at the forefront and the center, of what we're doing, and that's been, I think, one of the bigger learning curves, for me, where my career before this was sales, and so we were reselling other people's, products. We weren't building anything, really, and so coming to Tild and being the founder of a product first, API first organization where we're going and selling to some of the biggest brands, in the world that are trusting us and the product, that we've built out is really interesting. And so I think I've learned a lot about, technology, engineering, product development, managing a product roadmap. And, I've definitely improved a lot, in the last 6 years, but there's definitely still, work to be done there. Fortunately, we've got some incredible folks, on our team that have that, experience and are gracious, in the learning process, with me.
Yeah. What has been some of your tactics or lessons as you have gone through other ways of delivering a message?
Yeah, I think there's two critical pieces to this. There's like, what is the actual vision and story, that you want to tell, and then how do you actually want to tell and deliver, that story. And so on the planning side of things, I think it's been really helpful for me to work, with others to craft the general idea of where, we think we're going. But at the end of the day, it has to be your vision as the founder. Otherwise, it's never going to feel authentic. And so to me, the lesson is like, crowdsource the input, but like you have to be responsible for that final product of like, hey, here's the vision. And then on the delivery side of things, I think for me, I am generally better at just delivering kind of a stream of conscious, hey, here's the vibe of what I want to get out there. And so I don't rehearse the actual words that I want to say, but what I do think about is being intentional about what I want people to feel about the message, that I'm delivering. And so I think whether you need to actually rehearse what you want to say or not depends on who you are as a person. But I think for anyone that's trying to deliver, a message, trying to understand how you want someone to feel after they hear the message, I think is an incredibly powerful, little tidbit that can make an unbelievable difference in how that message is actually received, by the people that you're speaking to.
Mm. Yeah, and just to add to that, actually, Caleb, if I may, because I had another podcast guest, and she talks about also communication internally. And one thing she was mentioning as well was the context, because sometimes we, as us that are delivering or giving a message, we forget sometimes that people don't have the full picture. So a message that we believe is super clear can actually be completely misunderstood because people are coming from a different corner of the organization.
Yeah, incredibly powerful. We talk a lot, about that, where like I, as the founder, generally have 100% context, and, maybe my leadership team has 90% context, and every, layer that you go down in the organization, they have substantially less context about, what's going on. And so I actually love, that message and that tip, because it can make a pretty big difference in how people receive the information if they don't fully understand, what it is that you're talking about.
I wanted to move forward as we're looking ahead of time. And one of the things I wanted to hear your thoughts on, also when you're in this very incredibly exciting area, what would you like to see, or what do you expect to see changing in your specific field within the next 5 years?
Yeah. So I started my career as like an independent sales organization going door to door. And now I'm in this world of, vertical software led payments. And I think the conversation that I hear a lot of times from folks is like, which one of these two strategies is going to win out? And my opinion is that it's really somewhere in the middle. And the better question is like, how do these two, worlds coexist together to create, a better future? And so, what do I hope to see, and what do I think, will happen is that, over the next couple of years, you're going to see a shift in the mindset of some of these independent sales organizations, that you're not actually competing against these vertical software platforms. It's, hey, how can I actually work together, with some of these, vertical software platforms to be a distribution channel for them? And I think that's the, contrarian thought that I have right now, is that my opinion is, in payments, distribution is king. And these, legacy organizations and these more traditional, ISOs are incredible at distribution. Whereas a lot of these vertical software platforms have an incredible product. They've developed this great, niche, solution, but they don't have the distribution that, some of the more, traditional players have. And so I'm actually excited to see, some of the evolution, between those two models. And obviously, at Tild, we're helping, shape that trend.
Just as you are talking about that, do you see there's a lot of conversation here on this side of the pond about partnering versus building or buying, and also across the European Union, that we need to partner and work together also across sectors. On your side of the pond, is there an equal focus on that, or what's the mood on that particular piece?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we are being contacted by all sorts of organizations, from processors, card bands, banks, huge fintechs, that are evaluating this new world that we're living in, where they need to go be competitive in this vertical software ecosystem. But the technology that they built to date really isn't all that competitive, in this new sector. And I think, a few years ago, some of these guys were just burying their head in the sand, like, oh, we don't need to worry, about that. But since COVID, you've seen trillions of dollars in payments change hands between these two models. And so fast forward a few years later, every one of these guys is waking up to the reality that build by partner, that's the decision. You can no longer sit here and say, oh, we don't need to worry about, vertical software, in payments. It's like, no, you definitely do. The question is, how do you want to respond to it? And I think our personal experience is that most folks are really looking at partnering as the fastest way, for them to go to market. There've been a handful that have bought solutions, a handful that have tried, to build solutions. But, practically speaking, we've spent 6 years and tens of millions of dollars building, this solution. And so when you're actually doing that, hey, do I want to build, do I want to partner, conversation, those product and engineering teams are looking at this and saying, I'm not sure that we actually want to go through, the process to build this, let's go partner. And I think the current economic environment is also fueling some of that, debate, where folks aren't wanting to go commit tens of millions of dollars, to new projects. And so I think partnering, in this current environment becomes, that logical decision point.
It's super interesting. It's going to be, I think the next just 12 months is going to be very interesting to follow and see what's going to happen in the market overall globally. As we're wrapping up, I wanted to hear who you are following, because here at Pantrium, we love thinking bold and be inspired by others. who do you go to or who do you follow that inspire you these days?
Yeah. Hopefully he never hears this. But James Shepard, is somebody that I've been following for quite a long time in the payment space. I would consider him like the OG of payments content. He's been doing a podcast and putting out, content online long before it was, the cool thing to do. And I think what I appreciate about, his approach is that even though a lot of his audience are these more traditional, independent sales organizations, a lot of the content that he's putting out is really pushing the boundaries on like, hey, here's how you need to be thinking, about the world, and putting out, at least in my opinion, some more controversial, viewpoints. And I've had the pleasure of joining him on, his podcast several times, and, have gotten to know him over the years. And I really just appreciate the way that, he continues to challenge the status quo in payments, and then be thoughtful about, putting out content to be helpful to his audience.
Brilliant. Well, that's a good little recommendation as well for the listeners. And last question, Caleb, through your career and early as a salesman, or even in school, who has been a leader that have made a big impact on you?
Yeah, I think given the course of the conversation in the podcast today, I got to give a shout out to our leadership coach, Scott Burkale. I feel like he has really challenged me in ways that I never thought possible, and really made me into the CEO that I am today. So he's with Compass Advisors. Shameless plug if anyone's looking for a leadership coach, but just incredibly grateful for the impact that he's had on me, as an individual, and then Tild as an organization. Just can't thank him enough, for that impact.
Fantastic. Final words. It has been an absolute pleasure to have you on the Pantrium Podcast. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks for having me on today. Really appreciate it.
If this episode gave you something to think about, I'll be really grateful if you could share this with your LinkedIn network. And to make sure you don't miss out on any new episodes, simply follow Pantrium wherever you are listening or watching. And just a note, the opinions and views shared by our guests are entirely their own and don't necessarily represent the businesses they work for. We really hope you enjoyed this episode. Until next time, bye for now.